Hello, I'm Christopher Bellavita with the Center for Homeland Defense and Security, and welcome to the Master's Thesis series. Our guest today is Mourad Mourad, who is a Sergeant of Detectives for the New York City Police Department. Hi, Mourad.
Hi, Dr. Bellavita. How are you?
You don't need to know that. Okay, so tell me about your thesis.
So my thesis is really a comprehensive look of the current threat our nation faces, who the threat actors are and what causes them to act that way. Look at all the programs around the nation, not all, majority of the programs around the nation that hope to counter violent extremism, provide some set of tools that could be used to assess the risk involved with these individuals, and proposes a multidisciplinary model that will then interject and intervene prior to an individual carrying out an act of violence.
Okay, so before we get into the details of the thesis, tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you do? What's your day job?
My day job, basically investigating terrorism in the virtual realm.
In the what world?
In the virtual realm.
Oh, what's that mean?
In the cyberspace, as far as monitoring people who are expressing some sort of affinity towards terrorist organizations.
And how long have you been doing that?
Almost going on 5 years now.
Okay, so what's the relationship between what your day job is and what your thesis is?
My day job is is a needed factor to secure our nation, right?
I don't know.
To prevent terrorism, to prevent actors, so on and so forth. What my thesis looks at is prior to the individual reaching that threshold of radicalization into wanting to commit an act of violence, what could be done, what markers are there, what services are available that could be provided to that individual, if possible,
yes,
that are not available currently in our nation.
Okay, so this is the shorthand for that, countering violent extremism
Yes.
Strategy?
Yes.
I thought we already had that down in this country.
So we did a great job, right? The majority of the countering violent extremism, the CVE programs in the nation, focus on engaging communities at large. So talking to large amount of people, saying, hey, we want to help you assimilate in this great nation of ours. These are the services that we're here to offer. We're your friends. Let us know if you see something that's suspicious. And despite some articles that came out reputing that sort of tactic, it's been very welcomed by communities.
Has it had any impact on reducing radicalization?
Well, that's one thing. You can't measure that when you engage in communities at large. What my thesis proposes is that we need to set up some sort of centralized reporting system that if I have a relative of mine, a family member, a friend, that I believe is going down a path of violent extremism, for me to notify the authorities in a way where they could interject and not prosecute them, but provide them with what is needed to divert them away from that path of violent extremism.
So you're looking for communities to start spying on other people in the communities?
It's not spying. We're not asking people to spying, because if you're spying, you're promoting somebody to be prosecuted, right?
I don't know.
What spying comes? Oh well, that's one of the programs been accused of in
New York, right?
In Montgomery County, that people came out and say, hey, you are using the community, who's part of this MDT they have.
MDT means what?
Multidisciplinary team.
Okay.
To use the community to go out and spy on people in it. What we're saying is that be transparent as to what a program is going to do. Roll out a program with absolute transparency, explaining this is the program that we plan on implementing.
Yes.
We plan on intervening, interjecting, and providing the necessary, whether it's social services, mentorship, in any case, depending on the individual, to get them the appropriate treatment. As opposed to what's currently happening now is just approaching communities at large and telling them, hey, we are here to help you and we have these social services for everybody. If somebody is allergic to peanuts, you can't give them peanuts. You gotta give them something that is not peanut based. So this thesis proposes a tailored method for every individual to assess him and understand what are the causes of radicalization, what is a cycle of radicalization the individual is going through to express these desires to commit an act of violence.
Okay, before we get into the details of your recommendations, let's start with the threat. I recall reading in your thesis that most of the CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism effort, has gone toward Islamic violent extremists. And you make an argument in there that that's okay, but there's more to the threat than that. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So whenever we hear the word radicalization in the media, it always has this tie to Islamic terrorism.
Yeah.
And that is not the largest threat we face in this nation. We have almost an active shooter situation every day in this country in which we're not addressing that issue. Right-wing extremism, left-wing extremism. And you cannot roll out a program that is focused on a threat that is not the largest threat in our nation. It should be more inclusive and cover a wider array of the spectrum of the actual threat that's directed on our homeland.
When you say the threat is more than just radical violent Islamists, some examples? What do you mean the left wing and the right wing?
I mean, you have groups like Antifa, you have the Proud Boys, you have an individual like recently Bauer who walked into a synagogue and killed Jews, a school shooter in Florida. And
those are greater threats than radical Islam in this country?
They happen more often than the Islamic jihadists.
Okay, and then you write about that most of the government efforts so far have ignored that part of the radical spectrum?
That is correct.
So why do you think most of the focus is on Islamic terrorism and not the other forms of terrorism that you studied?
Well, I think that Islamic terrorism gains much more traction via the media as opposed to other acts of terrorism. And when you have a lot of people paying attention to one threat, it might seem appropriate to focus on that one certain threat. However, what we're not paying attention to is the frequency in other terrorist groups that currently exist in our nation that we're not addressing, that people are going on forums and being radicalized just for white supremacy, just as individuals are being radicalized by the Islamic State. And if we're going to address the issue of those being radicalized by the Islamic State and ignore the ones being radicalized on white supremacy or left-wing extremist groups, what's going to happen within time is that threat will grow greater.
Okay. In your thesis, you looked through a number of models that purport to explain radicalization. What's your so what after you looked at all of those? It's I think a really good review that people can use in their classes and other ways of quickly getting a grasp on the models that are out there. What did you take away from all those models?
I took away that, they all serve a purpose and they should continue to do what they do.
Which is what?
Which is the community engagement, the multidisciplinary team
I didn't ask my question correctly. I'm not talking about the models of intervention, the CVE programs. I'm talking about the literature that you looked at to describe how radicalization happens.
Okay, so the models I looked at were the Violent Extremist Risk Assessment model, which looks at...
Are you going to go through each of the models?
Yeah.
I don't think you need to.
Okay.
I'm saying, what's your takeaway from all of this?
So my takeaway is to look at the behavioral issues that are involved with the individual.
Okay.
Where you're able to check or ask questions relating to somebody's behavior, and more importantly, deduct those behavior and not include them as a risk if the person justifies that behavior.
My takeaway from reading that is that there is no one good model to explain why people are radicalized. You have some structural models in there, you have individual models, you have psychological models, and so on. That was my takeaway from reading that. That you have all these models, but none of them are good at predicting.
I think when you combine them and you take from, as I propose to combine from the models, what you believe will be a successful combination in identifying the risk.
So you went through 10 case studies of people who had been radicalized.
Correct.
And then you have a series of charts in your thesis where you look at each of the individual cases against the literature that you review.
Correct.
And so what's your takeaway from all that? I didn't see any pattern in there.
There was no pattern because there is no linear path to radicalization. You're going to have similarities amongst individuals, and you're also going to have disparities. And it's different for every person, and that's why you need that tailored intervention approach. You need to treat every person based on their pattern of behavior, what they're going through.
So you did not create or invent your model brand new. You reviewed a lot of existing CVE models that are in this country and in the United Kingdom. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so what do you take away from those models? What were the factors that you thought were helpful and maybe others that were not so helpful in the US context?
I think they all brought some sort of benefit to the table. But what we're missing here is that centralized reporting system in which a concerned parent, family member could phone in and say, I'm worried about my child. I've seen him go on a white supremacy forum, on an ISIS forum, or acting in a violent behavior, saying he wants to hurt other children in school.
Yes.
And be able to say, I want to call this number and let them know about my child because they're going to provide the appropriate services and take them off that path of violent extremism and basically rehabilitate that individual.
Okay, so the idea is you're taking the best from the existing models that you looked at in this country?
That is correct.
And in the United Kingdom? And then you're combining them into your multidisciplinary team or MBT model, is that correct?
That is correct.
Say a little bit about the elements in that and where it came from, where the model came from.
So the multidisciplinary teams have been around for a very long period of time, used in medicine, cybersecurity, mental health, treating elderly, in which they're able to say, you need this medicine, but you also need rehab. You need a person to talk to keep you psychologically sane and able to function on a daily basis. And have also come from the UK Channel program. Montgomery County has a MDT, and the DEEP program in New York City. So
what is the DEEP program?
The DEEP program basically works with people prosecuted for terrorism, and throughout their sentencing, they work towards rehabilitating the individual, getting rid of that violent extremism ideology that they might.
So you reviewed the elements of the existing models.
Yes.
And then you developed your own model.
Correct.
Okay, so tell me about that model, how it's different from the other ones.
So the model is different, two aspects, right? If a subject is no longer on law enforcement's radar, he's not reaching the threshold of prosecution, as we've seen in Florida, Omar Mateen, interviewed twice by the FBI, and that was it. There was no criminality there.
Because the FBI and other agencies don't have the resources to continue monitoring lots of people who are not under their radar?
From a prosecution aspect, they have a ton of resources. But if we're going from a preventive aspect, in which we're thinking about this issue from another way of preventing violent extremism, you're going to have to involve other key actors who aren't in law enforcement.
Okay.
There are mental health professionals, that are
religious
leaders, mentors, a community leader, somebody they will be look up to and connect to, in which they were able to possibly disengage them from going down a path.
Now I get that those are features of existing CVE models as well, these multidisciplinary teams.
Correct.
What's new in your model?
Well, what's new in my model is basically saying that local law enforcement should own this model.
Wow.
Right?
No, I'm not there yet.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to get the sense of this is a community and not just a law enforcement issue, why do you want law enforcement running this?
Because somebody has to organize it. It can't just be ad hoc when you have somebody coming in calling a tip about an individual they're concerned about. Well, how are you going to structure it? I'm not saying law enforcement is going to be heavily involved. They're just going to maintain the order for the multidisciplinary team.
So this comes out of the collective action model?
Correct.
Okay, and that model says that there needs to be one kind of home base for this program.
It says one home base for the program, and it's not one sole agency that's responsible for that issue, and it's not also one sole agency that's capable of solving this issue.
And I understand that, but I don't get you don't see that there are more downsides to having law enforcement being kind of the home of this, as opposed to churches or schools or mental health agencies or government administrative agencies?
So that's one aspect of it. That's one way to look at it. But the other side to look at it is like, hey, law enforcement is here to help us. They're not prosecuting my son. Let's take Omar Mateen, for example.
Yeah.
Interviewed by FBI, nothing happened. FBI would have phoned this, say hypothetically, central reporting system, and law enforcement would have got the name of the individual, convened with the multidisciplinary team, and then said, all right, well, where does he fit on our spectrum? He has anger management, he has problems at home. Law enforcement is not leading that tabletop. That's Omar Mateen and social workers and mental health professionals. Law enforcement is just there to present it to the individuals of the MDT, and then that's pretty much it. If there's a safety concern, law enforcement could go with the mental health professionals, the psychologists, in any case, whichever services are needed with that individual, but they're not there to intervene with the professional process.
You write about relationships between police and communities in your thesis.
Yeah.
Do you think that the communities from which these radical groups, not across the spectrum, emerge, that their relationship with law enforcement in general is such that they would trust having a cop involved in this?
Well, trust is built, right? Like, trust is gained. And when you see one success story after another, in which an individual is not prosecuted, like they've done in gang models, that builds that relationship, builds that trust. And with trust will come great success. But there has to be some sort of leap in faith. So law enforcement takes more risks on a daily basis, dealing with mentally ill people, the youth, and it's more domestic violence. More often than not, it's not the most pleasant interactions, right? But there might be a pleasant interaction saying, hey, my son's being bullied at school, he's expressed violence, but he's not doing anything about it. And law enforcement could bring him to a social worker, a mental health psychologist, or a mentor to speak to, whatever that individual needs, right? And we've seen how the NYPD and other law enforcement agencies have continued to drop the level of crime by building on neighborhood policing model, which enhances neighborhood relationships with the police department, which the neighborhood is involved with the local beat officers. They're talking to them weekly.
Yep.
The community is coming out, they're expressing their concerns, they're informing the local precincts about what needs to be done, what they think. The community has better eyes and ears than any law enforcement officer.
So is that relationship of trust a precondition for adopting your model in the community?
There has to be a community relationship established with law enforcement first, prior to implementing such a model. Because if you have a community that doesn't trust its law enforcement, you're not there yet.
Okay. Does it require that does your model require that law enforcement be the home?
That's what my model proposes, correct.
Is that how it's primarily different from the dozen or so other models that you've looked at?
That's one of the main differences. And we want to, it's mainly because we want to avoid that scrutiny, like you mentioned earlier, of being spies. We're not going to tell people this is not a law enforcement-led program. We want to be transparent, honest, let them know what we're providing and what we're looking for. If it's implemented, I think it could have great success, and it could furthermore enhance the currently incredibly relationship between the communities and law enforcement.
Do you have any evidence that it might lead to the success, or is that just kind of a hope or a wish on your part?
No, there have been a few cases that occurred in LA, in New York.
With their models?
With their models where they had that intervention, they intervened with the individual, and the person has been disengaged from a radical ideology. So And another thing it provides you some sort of measurement. If you're doing something wrong, if there's something wrong happening, you're able to say, well, this is not working. We got to go back to the table and restructure it.
I don't understand, and if there are existing models that have success associated with it, why do we need a new model?
Because the other models have had success in different states, and there's not really much about it. People don't know unless you go researching heavily for it.
Okay.
It's not out there. So I propose being transparent and implementing an ad campaign and coming out and saying, this is what we plan to do. This is how we want to make communities safer. This is what we want to envision in the future, this relationship where law enforcement not just there to arrest you, but also give you the proper service to intervene and take you off a path of violent extremism.
So what would you look as measures of success for your model?
Measures of success in my model will be, the parent calling you afterwards and saying, thank you for saving my son. Thank you for helping my daughter. Thank you for providing my family with the resources they needed.
And what happens when you start getting people calling in their neighbors or people they're having disputes with or flooding the system? There may not be anything to this, but I saw some guys hanging out in the barbershop and it just didn't feel right. You guys check it out.
That's a false positive. That's what you call 911 and 3114 for a criminal. This is about individuals' behaviors who are concerning that you know for sure they're going down a path of violent extremism. If you think somebody's suspicious, that's why you have the local law enforcement patrol officers, the beat cops, to handle those type of situations. That's a different aspect.
So you don't see any potential downsides to implementing your model?
I don't see the downside of
Anybody you talk to see any potential downsides?
The obvious aspect is how do people going to trust law enforcement that they're not going to prosecute them?
That seems like a big deal.
That's a big deal, right? But law enforcement, honest, transparency, trust, and you build that connection. And you make the neighborhood feel like you're there to protect them and provide them services.
Okay, talk to me about the resource requirements to have these multidisciplinary teams operating under your model or any of the related models.
Well, every city majority of cities have a mental health response team that is equipped with the mental health professionals. So that's resource. They have social workers. You have people who donate their time to help policemen, firemen who are ex-sports, professional sports players that could use as mentorships. You could even take it a step further and deal with prior white supremacy or prior ISIL fighters and have them come and speak to people who are going down that path and explain to them what they felt and where they found out they were wrong after they were rehabilitated.
So you don't see a lot of new resources required for this, but just kind of modifying the mission of the existing multidisciplinary
It's
teams.
like having a lot of friends that you haven't seen in a long time, and you invite them over your house for dinner. They're there, you have your contacts, all you need to do, call them up, say, hey, come join me for dinner, let's talk about this, see how we can help people, and because they're already there. They're in your daily life. The connections are there, the organizations are there, the professionals are there. It's all about just implementing a program for local law enforcement to bring in those partners and have that conversation and explain what the main goal of the program is and what the goal isn't.
So who do you see benefiting from your thesis, from reading it or at least being aware of it and skimming it?
Anybody who wants to lessen violence, if they have a spike in school shooting, if you want to have a spike with terrorism recruitment, if you have you could even implement it into gang violence. I mean, there's a wide array. You could
that's for implementing your model.
Yeah.
I'm talking, kind of step back a little bit, just taking a look at your whole thesis. Who's going to benefit from looking at your thesis? I'm trying to market it here.
Yeah, I mean, anybody can. I mean, there's anybody in the IC community, in the intelligence community, in the local law enforcement community, I think will benefit from reading.
What about academics?
Academics can for sure.
What are they going to get from your thesis?
They're going to get the operational perspective, a local law enforcement perspective of seeing what could be established from the operational experience, what we've seen. As you know, I deal on the opposite end of arresting individuals for terrorism.
I don't know what you mean by that. You deal at the opposite
end, where I'm not rehabbing people, but I'm prosecuting them,
okay.
right? So on the opposite end of it, saying, well, this is also an option that could be dealt from an operational viewpoint. This is what could happen. And through my case studies, I point out where the intervention could have happened.
Tell me about students. How could students of Homeland Security, of counterterrorism, benefit from reading your thesis? What are they going to get out of it?
They'll get a ton of resources that they could go into and read. And
resources like the bibliography and the citations you have?
Correct, like the citations, bibliography, case studies, and get a different way of thinking, an intervention method of points of intervention that could have occurred to the case studies that we have.
What do you, at the end of your whole thesis process, you took what, a year and a half to do this, plus your entire career before that?
Yeah.
What do you come away from this thesis knowing that you didn't know before you went into it? What did you learn from this?
I learned that you got to step back and really take an approach that you wouldn't normally think of.
And you didn't know this going into this?
I wanted to do something more in an investigative aspect. But I ended up on doing something on the preventive aspect, because through my research, reading and talking to yourself, I learned that you can't arrest your way out of this issue. This issue of violent extremism is not, doesn't have a one-way solution. There are many factors that go into it. Prosecution needed? Absolutely. Is it for everybody? Is everybody going to be able to be rehabilitated and disengage from violent extremism? Absolutely not. That's why the risk assessment tools that propose say this person might be a good candidate or this person is not. He has gone way too far. This is way too risky, and we are not going to take that chance on the individual who is so far down a path of radicalization.
So nobody gets to study everything they want in the thesis process. So at the end of it, did any issues come up that if you had more time and more resources, you'd like to have gone down and looked at?
I would have liked to look at how this could be done virtually via disengagement via virtual approach.
Kind of like virtual medicine. Sometimes you have a doc at the other end of a video.
So we've seen like with AI recently, like
AI is what?
Artificial intelligence coming out, and Michael Phelps commercial about I wouldn't have been as good as I was if I was a psychiatrist, and he's doing it online. So how could this identification of individuals on the spectrum of violent extremism and engage them just purely virtually, would it be effective as an in-person disengagement and tailoring?
You don't see this heading into Minority Report?
No, well, again, like you'd have to scope it, right? Because you don't want to go spying on people, right? You don't want to go.
Yeah, well, you also want to make sure that you have your eyes out on people who are on the edge.
It depends, like how much they express an affinity to terror. You don't want to just go through a wide net. You want to scope it down. So, I didn't get into this research, but I would say this would only be a very proactive service via somebody reaching out to you saying via email or whatever case may be. This person, I noticed on his social media, talking about how he hates his schoolmates, so on and so forth, and they would identify those people for you, and maybe you could then do some sort of rehabilitation. In the virtual space, it would be interesting to.
The MDTs would operate on the virtual space as well.
Who knows? Yeah. Who knows then? How would it operate, or where we would be with the proliferation of technology and where we're going with computerized systems,
artificial intelligence,
intelligence, and what would they be able to do?
Any other issues come up that you would have liked to have spent more time on?
I would have really liked to look at other international programs, disparities amongst different cultures, communities, how they I would have liked to see the surveys of like ideas to kind of like
Yes.
see how the acceptance rate from one city to another, and to say, all right, well, you got a very high acceptance rate here in this city. I think it'll be a great
Nice.
model for you to implement. You're not there yet with the community relationships. I would advise you to build up that component in order to roll out such a program, to do that sort of survey.
You have an implementation strategy for your thesis? What happens to it now? Just put it on the shelf and say, I'm done?
Well, we'll see. Pitch it, see what.
Pitch it, what's that mean?
Present it.
Where?
I like to present it to local law enforcement agencies around the nation and see if they could benefit from this idea and help and roll out this program if it's beneficial for their communities.
So this video might be a step in that implementation process.
I hope so.
Yeah, so how do people get in touch with you?
Contact me via email.
Thanks for taking your time this morning to talk about this. I've actually enjoyed this conversation and enjoyed having you in class too.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm honored to be here.
Okay.
Thank you.